I remember April 2009 when we brought together the G20 in London, and we had a dinner the night before the major meeting. And I remember my first words at that dinner. I reminded them of what Winston Churchill had said about the protectionist response in the 1930s. And he had said that people had been resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. And to add to that, Keynes had said that the 30s had shown that politics was the survival of the unfittest. And I was determined that we would not repeat what had happened in the 1930s when nations withdrew into the national silos, international cooperation became impossible, protectionism, and then everything that we now know resulted from that. And yet, here in 2020, we have a global medical emergency. And of course, we cannot solve the global economic emergency until we make progress in the medical emergency. But we do not have either in health cooperation or in economic cooperation the level of collaboration that is essential if we're going to either solve the problem of vaccines and the capacity to deliver medical equipment, but also the problems that we face in the economy being resolved. And so we are at the point at which we are dealing with rescue. We are not even at the point yet of recovery, but there is no sense that the G20 or the international community is going to come together in the way it did in 2009. And that means that we will have an inadequate response, both medically and economically. And that is what's got to change. And Larry and I do attribute many of these ideas to Larry, we have set down some of the measures that need to be taken, but they have to be taken urgently. We're not talking about months and years, we're talking about weeks and days when I think the international community has got to act.
And Larry, let me ask you if you'd continue with this in explaining just where you think the global cooperation agenda should go. We have a G20 meeting coming up in the fall. What should be on the agenda for that meeting and for right now?
History will judge us. There is a sense, if you look at stock markets, that maybe things are coming back and everything's going to be okay. If you look at economic statistics, that sense is not fortified. If you look at what's happening in the emerging markets in the developing world, one sees huge things to cause for concern. Countries where you can recommend washing your hands, but people do not have access to running water. You can recommend quarantining, but people do not have separate space. You can recommend fiscal expansion, but governments don't have the room. You can recommend easy money, but the result will be a catastrophe for the local currency. And that's why a global response is necessary. What are some of the elements of that global response? Assuring an adequate flow of credit so that countries can borrow to get themselves through the extraordinary expenses and extraordinary deficits that are going to take place right now. Why should the richest be able to borrow, as the United States is, on an inordinate scale, and those who are even more in need, those with even less reserves, be unable to borrow? So it's more resources from the World Bank. It's the expansion of the financial system known as special drawing rights that enables more liquidity to be available to all countries. It's critically a framework for addressing what would otherwise be hugely punitive debts, and it's support for collaboration, because viruses don't know about immigration rules. Viruses don't know about international boundaries. These are the crucial elements if we're to maximize the prospect for a relatively successful outcome. And while the Bank of England or the Fed have acted on an enormous scale, while The U.S. government has acted on enormous scale, as have many European countries. There has been nothing that feels strongly abnormal yet from the international community, and that's not the failure of the leadership of the IMF or the Bank of International Settlements. That's the failure of the countries that control those institutions, and of course, the country that has led in the past in responding to international crises is the United States, and we have rejected the very idea of an international community, and that I think will prove to have been a grave mistake.